We're about to enter into the story of World War II. And how do you tell this story as it relates to the church? World War II was the most monumentous episode or issue during the 20th century. It brought about the modern era. It introduced the atomic age, it introduced the age of television, of cassette recordings, of jet travel. It created America as a superpower that it still is today, that no other nation on earth can contest the power of the Americans. At no point in history could a leader of an army or a government on a Tuesday afternoon issue a single or a set of orders that would destroy hundreds of millions of people, which is the atomic age. We forget the dangerous age that we live in. Oops, I'll just take this off because otherwise my head's going to explode. So I want to approach this not glorifying the event or getting caught up in the technology, the details, which perhaps we often do. We're still telling stories of World War II. I want to approach it from three perspectives of how the church, Christians, not necessarily the institutional church, but Christians themselves. And one is simply this: Christians joined the army en masse. Pastors joined the army. There was no distinction. So on one sense, the church radically embraced, and Christians radically embraced the cause. And we'll see why as we go along. Then the other extreme, we're going to talk about the pacifists and the Mennonites and the labor camps and the internment camps in Canada. What happened to those who refused to serve and how they were interred in places across Canada. Actually, none in Saskatchewan, surprisingly, but in camps across Canada. And then there was really the cutting edge of war and religion, and that is the role of chaplains. So we're going to take a look at two chaplains in particular, a chaplain in the German army and a chaplain in the Canadian army, and see how Christians of deeply held faith confronted or wrestled with the issue of how do I bring a message of forgiveness and joy and hope into the war. And chaplains really were, they weren't combatants, but they were pacifists. And so they bridged this gap between the combatants and the pacifists and tried to walk a very delicate line, and sometimes succeeded, but very sadly all too often failed in doing that. So we're going to approach it in those three ways. And again, the first one's very simple. They just went and they joined up. All right, tell me what you know about World War II. Anything particular?
Remember the day it started?
Remember the day it started?
1939.
Yep. America came late to the party as usual.
There were rations everywhere.
Food rationing? Good. Who were the big players?
Britain,
Russia?
Germany,
Germany?
Japan,
Italy? All right, well, this is going to be good because some of this will be new to you then. All right, we're going to do a very, very brief history of the war, just to put things in context. These are the combatants. Everybody in yellow are the Allies, and everybody in red are the Axis powers. So Japan, Germany, Italy, Romania, and Finland on the Axis powers, and the rest, the green ones, and then the rest are neutrals. And you see a little piece of neutrality in the middle with Switzerland, and Spain was neutral as well. One thing about, interesting, Ireland's neutral as well. In the atomic age, no one's neutral. If America and the Soviets went to war, Switzerland would not escape. So in the age we live in, there are no neutral powers. You can claim to be. All right, let's just take a brief look at the story of conflict, really the Allies versus the Axis powers. World War II does, technically in Europe, starts on September of 1939, but it actually started in 1931, in September 18th, when Japan invaded Manchuria. You know what, we should turn this light on. That's better.
Well, I guess maybe 39 is when Canada got it.
Precisely, Shirley, yeah. Yeah, for us it started in 39. For the rest of the world it started in 31, as Japan expanded its empire. Between October and May, the Italians invaded and conquered and annexed Ethiopia. Sorry, my software did a weird glitch. That does, I think I cleaned most of them up, but laid up, you must put a picture here, boxes every once in a while. So, great movie called Line in the Desert, by the way, if you want to watch that story. Then on July 7th, 1937, Japan invaded China. On March 1938, Germany incorporated Austria in what was called the Anschluss. It was the political invasion or annexation of Austria because Hitler was Austrian. He took over Austria, but not through military might, purely through political means. Then in March of that same year, the Slovaks declared independence, and they formed the Slovak Republic, and Germany occupied and dismantled Czechoslovakia. The Czech lands and the Slovak lands, hence Czechoslovakia. As Shirley alluded to, September 1st, 1939 was officially when the Allied power, or the war began. Germany attacked Poland across its borders. And then 2 days later, on September 3rd, honoring their peace treaties and their guarantees, we entered Great Britain and France, declared war on Germany. And we get the season called the Phony War at this point, because nothing's happening. Then on September 17th, just a few days later, the Soviets invaded Poland, right? They didn't want the Germans to roll through Poland onto Soviet soil, so they entered into Poland to meet the Germans head on. And Poland, as a consequence, suffers more casualties per capita than any other country in the world. September 27th, Warsaw is captured. I didn't have a picture, but this is the last charge of cavalry. Christine, if you want to turn that fan on, it is warm in here. We have scenes of Polish cavalry with, bamboo lances attacking German tanks. Needless to say, Poland didn't last long. Then we get what's called the Winter War. Between November 30th and March 12th, 1940, the Soviet Union invaded Finland and lost. By the way, the Finns were able to stop the Soviets. And then in the spring of 1940, April, May, and June, in those 3 months, Germany invades Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrenders on the day of the attack, and if Peter was here, he would tell us that story. But Norway holds out for a couple of months. And we get what was the beginnings of airborne warfare, as it was German paratroopers and naval disembarkments that conquers Norway. You see where the paratroopers are? That was where German paratroopers. And we get the beginning of a different kind of warfare now with airborne warfare. And then we get the big story. Colden. That's Luxembourg, by the way.
May 10th, 1940, June 22nd, 1940, German attacks Western Europe, specifically France and the neutral Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Luxembourg is occupied on May 10th, the Netherlands surrendered on May 14th, and Belgium surrenders on May 28th. On June 22nd, France signs an armistice agreement by which the Germans occupy the northern half of the country and the entire Atlantic coastline. In southern France, a collaborationist regime with its capital Vichy is established.
Very well done. That's, a lot of syllables there. During World War I, between 1914 and 1918, the Germans could not conquer France. How long did it take them? How many weeks? Between May 10th and June 22nd? 6. They conquered Europe in 6 weeks. What no one could do in World War I in 4 years, the Germans did in 6 weeks. It just shows you the change of how technology had changed. And for the nerds in the room, it's the introduction of armor and air power and Blitzkrieg and lightning war and all this kind of stuff changes everything. But they rolled through. And France was divided. The northern part was under the control of the Germans, but the southern portion is called Vichy, the Vichy government, and they are still French, but they surrendered to the Germans. And all the French territories are now really under German control, but there's a false government, the traitors of France. This will be difficult for France after the war. And as the Germans, of course, invade France, we get the great miracle of Dunkirk, May 26th to June 4th in 1940, and there was a great movie a little while ago called Dunkirk, and we get the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, is able to escape back to England. They leave all their equipment, and this is a godsend because the equipment they had was antiquated, and it forced the British to create all new weapons, and it really updated their army into the modern era. And so in some ways it was a really good thing for Britain, but only in hindsight did they realize what a good thing it was. Because the Germans technologically outclassed the British on just about every level except one. So by 1940, what we get is the light colors are all, these light colors here all belong to the Germans. This is independent, and these are the Italian states. These all are part of the Axis. The gray here are the neutral territories. So already North Africa's. So basically by the end of 1940, everything but Spain and Switzerland now belongs to the Nazis and Great Britain. By 1942, the Japanese Empire had expanded as well. We see it into Korea, China, all the way down here to the Philippines, all the way just touching off the coast of Australia. So the Japanese Empire now has expanded. At its peak, the Germany controlled this much territory in the world. What's one curious country on that map that you didn't think should be controlled by the Germans? There's one little odd country.
Whatever that means. Denmark?
Madagascar, off the coast of Africa. Why did the Nazis get Madagascar? It's the weirdest story. Let me tell you that weird little story of how the Nazis controlled Madagascar. Now, Madagascar is massively important to the British Empire because if you are moving goods, I don't want to spill water, from Britain around the Horn, you need to refuel here before you get here. This is an Allied refueling station and port. So it is a very, very important place to the Allied, because we're shipping things by coal, right? Coal ships. The Nazis developed what they called the Madagascar Plan. Felicia, take it away.
The Madagascar Plan was a proposal by the Nazi German government to forcibly relocate the Jewish population of Europe to the island of Madagascar. The idea of deporting Jews to Madagascar was revived by the Nazi government in 1940. With Adolf Hitler's approval, Adolf Eichmann released a memorandum on the 15th of August 1940 calling for the resettlement of 1 million Jews per year for 4 years, with the island being governed as a police state under the SS.
The original Nazi plan was not to execute the Jewish population. It was to remove it, put it on ships, send it to Madagascar, and have it policed by the SS there. Madagascar was a French island, and once France fell, it belonged to the Vichy government, which belonged to the Nazis. So the Nazis had control of Madagascar, and this was the plan, the Madagascar Plan. But can you imagine how the world would have been different? There would be no Israel, because Madagascar would have become the new Israel. Grady.
During the war, the colonial administration under the leadership of Governor General Armand Manet of French Madagascar pledged their allegiance to Britain and Vichy France. An Allied naval force consisting of over 50 ships arrived off the coast of Madagascar in May 1942. Japanese submarines also participated in the battle, with the submarines 110 and 116, 120 attacking British ships. The submarines launched midget submarines that attacked HMS Ramillies, damaging her, and sunk the British motor tanker British Loyalty.
This is the only point in World War II where the French and the Japanese fight together. It's an odd moment. So we have the Vichy French on land and the Japanese submarines at sea fighting a British invasion force. It's really a quirky little Paul Harvey moment. Needless to say, the Allies land and they take Madagascar away from the French. The Madagascar Plan never occurs, and the Allies retain their coaling station on the island of Madagascar. So just a curious little side note. June 14th, 1940, Paris falls to the Nazis. Between July 10th and October 31st, 1940, Britain fights for its life. Remember I said the Allies didn't have any technology greater than the Germans except one, and that is air power. And so we get the Battle of Britain. If you want to see one of those, in Wetaskiwin at the Aviation Museum, a Hawker Hurricane is parked there. You can go crawl on around it. Pretty cool. This is Churchill's great line. Shirley?
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
So this is Churchill's great cry. September 13th, 1940, the Italians who had been in northern Africa, they now invade Egypt and begin to push the British back to, which means they would control the Suez Canal. And once they control the Suez Canal, then they can move into the oil fields of Romania, and they control the oil in North Africa, which would be devastating to the Allies. 1941, the Germans send the Africa Corps to North Africa to reinforce the faltering Italians. And you got to give, all things aside, that looks like a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. But that's... April 6th to June, Germany and Italy and Hungary invade Yugoslavia, and together with Bulgaria dismember it. Yugoslavia surrenders on April 17th. This will all come into play later on when the Soviets take over everything and create the Warsaw Pact. I know this doesn't... We'll get to the church part. I just need to know the story quick. Sorry. June 22nd, 1941, Germany makes its fatal mistake and invades Russia. Then the Johnny-come-lately show up. December 7th, almost 2 years later, 40 to 41, the U.S. is plunged into war. So Britain held out for 2 years. You ever been to Hawaii? Doug and Monty, have you been to this place? Yeah. Myrtle, this is Roosevelt's great statement.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I suspect many of you hear that in a different voice. You hear Roosevelt's, famous, "This state shall live in infamy." Like he had a staccato rhythm. But you can hear it in your head. He's got his cigarette, his holder. Cigar, yeah. Oops, yeah, my software is doing weird things. But on December 11th and 13th, they all declare war on the U.S. Things change very quickly, and the story will wrap up pretty fast. May 13th, 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrender to the Allies. We get Erwin Rommel in the North African campaign. Patton lands in North Africa. There's a great moment in Patton's life where they're deciding which river to cross on, and Patton is at a war table with all these maps. And there's and he said, okay, we'll cross the river here, the tanks will go here, the infantry will go, and the officers around the table say to him, but sir, we don't know how deep the river is, we don't know where we can ford, and they're giving him all these excuses, and Patton stops them all and says, look at my pants. And he steps back from the table, and he's wet up to here, because he had just come and walked across it. So, Patton was, I love that line, that's a great line for leadership. If you want people to follow you, just tell them to look at your pants. If they're not wet, they don't have to follow you. But Patton was that kind of guy. There was a drunk American soldier who was a rebel rouser and a fighter, and his name was George Patton as well. And rumor got out that Patton was drinking at night. And Patton found him, tracked him down, grabbed him by the sleeve, and said, either change your life or change your name. Which is also preaches very well, by the way. July 10th, 1943, U.S. and British troops land in Sicily. By mid-August, the Allies controlled Sicily. The Russians had been calling for an opening of the Second Front, and the Allies decided to go what was called the soft underbelly of Europe. They went up through Sicily, Greece, Italy, into Europe that way, rather than later on they would do with D-Day from the north. But initially, they took from the bottom and pushed the Germans. 1943, they deposed Mussolini, and he was arrested, but the Germans rescued him. September 8th, 1943, the Italian government surrenders to the Allies, and the Germans immediately seize control of Rome and northern Italy. September 9th, the Allies land on the beaches of Salerno near Naples, uncontested. And then we get the next landing near Anzio, again, uncontested. These were all practiced landings for D-Day. But things don't go well in Italy. Canadians fight incredible and terrible battles there, but by June 4th, 1944, they liberate Rome. Then on June 6th, 1944, the U.S., British, and Canadian troops land in Normandy, beaches of France, opening a second front. June 22nd, barely 3 weeks later, 2 weeks, the Soviets launch what's called the Eastern Offensive, and they destroy German Army Group Center, and they drive towards Poland by August 1st. So the Nazis are being pushed on three sides. August 20th, 25th, the Allies reach Paris. Hitler orders Paris to be burned to the ground, and the German generals in control refuse the order and retreat and allow the Allies to enter unopposed. thereby saving Paris from destruction. October 20th, General MacArthur returns to the Philippines. I shall return. December 16th, the Germans launched the last offensive, which is known as the Battle of the Bulge. January 12th, the Soviets launch a new offensive. They liberate Warsaw and Krakow that January. April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. May 7th, 1945, Germans surrendered to the Allies. May 9th, they surrendered to the Soviets. There's a whole other story there. May 1945, Allied troops conquer Okinawa in that famous picture. And then we get the war coming to a close. Now you got to remember, even at this point, the Western Allies realize that the Soviets are a problem. That this is good, that post-war Europe is now having to be decided because the Soviets are pushing and taking all this territory, and they know for sure they're not going to retreat. Patton goes on to say, we've got the tanks here, let's fight it while we're here. Because he realizes what's going to happen in the future. And the Americans were very, very, very concerned that after they dropped the first bomb on August 8, 1945, the Soviets declared war on Japan, and they were going to invade Japan from the north. And Japan would roll up, and you would have Japan divided between the Americans and the Japanese. So they made the decision that day to drop the next bomb to pressure the Japanese to surrender to them, to not allow, because they wanted the surrender to occur before the Soviets got a single soldier on Japanese soil. Does that make sense? You don't want the Russians in Japan, so you have to really put a great deal of pressure on Japan to surrender now to us before the Soviets have a chance, because they had already declared war. And so we get the atomic bomb. The first one, it's an understatement to say it got the Japanese attention. The second one forced their hand. The first one could have been an accident, or it could have been a one of. But the Americans had 6 bombs ready, and they were ready to bomb. And they had left Hiroshima unaffected. During the B-29 bombings of Japan, they never dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima because they wanted to know what an atomic bomb looked like. So the people in Hiroshima felt relatively safe. They had seen the planes fly over, but not a single bomb had been dropped on them. So when the bomb was dropped, this is the banking tower, the devastation was just or singularly from an atomic blast. When the atomic bomb, the Trinity test first occurred, the scientists realized that it worked better than they thought, and they became very, very concerned because they realized this was only going to get bigger and worse. And Oppenheimer quotes the God of Ida, and he says, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. It's fascinating. They didn't know that when they set the bomb up, that it would not cause a chain reaction in the air. They had some concern that the water molecules would react around the blast and set off the atmosphere. So there were people very nervous that morning. Can you imagine? Well, we might destroy the Earth. We might not. Let's give it a try. So it was, I'm just listening to a podcast now about the atomic test. Amazing. This is Nagasaki. So, and just to put it in reference, that's where they are. So September 2nd, 1945, having agreed in principle to an unconditional surrender, August 14th, 1945, Japan formally surrendered, ending World War II. There's a fascinating movie about an American lieutenant who was given the order and the command to arrest the emperor, and his decision to not do it, because he knew what would happen. Japan would go up in arms if they arrested the emperor. So the emperor was never arrested, nor was he ever tried for war crimes. All right, just to put it in perspective, this is a death toll of percentage. So you see Poland suffered 17% casualties of its entire population. They suffered the most because the Germans invaded, then the Russians invaded, then the Germans pushed them back, then the Russians pushed them back. So they were conquered multiple times. Plus they had a large Jewish population that was destroyed. So Poland lost 6 million people during the war. Soviet Union lost, and you can see 14, Yugoslavia 11, Germany 8, all the way down to the U.S. with 0.3 and Canada 0.3. We didn't lose a lot of our population during World War II. The Europeans, by the time you get to, the big numbers start in Greece, where the Germans invaded, and then the Allies invaded. Later on, China with the Japanese invasion, the Netherlands, Finland, France, Romania, again. The big numbers start up in Eastern Europe, Germany, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, and Poland. All right. Bonnie, could you read? Oh, let's get Doug to read Churchill.
This house, no war of chieftains, or princes, of dynasties or national ambition. It is a war of peoples and of causes. There are vast numbers, not only in this island, but in every land, who will render faithful service in this war, but whose names will never be known, whose deeds will never be recorded. This is a war of the unknown warriors. Let all strive without failing in faith or in duty, and the dark curse of Hitler will be lifted from our age.
Churchill really described this war not as conflict. This is a war of ideals, of values, of systems, of beliefs. And so the Christian church entered into this war of people and causes. And Churchill's language of failing, without failing in faith, faithful service. The images of Christianity were very embossed on this. World War II was viewed as the Great Crusade. It was the last good war, the moral war. Dwight D. Eisenhower, on these orders on the Allied D-Day, said, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade." So it was couched in the language of faith and good. It was the good war. And now we move in that. So, no, we did World War II in 18 minutes. That's not bad. And as I said earlier, as we look at the three sides of how Christians dealt with the war, the one side was to engage, to become soldiers and fight the good fight the good crusade. On the other side were the pacifists, which we'll talk about at the end. But in that middle ground, and I want to focus on them this morning, are the chaplains. At the center of this tension between service to the state and service to God. How do you render and live your faith while serving your country, but you don't want to kill anybody, but you still want to serve your country? And so chaplains found themselves in this very unique position. And this is the German chaplain. Bonnie, can you read that top? Oh, no, you can't. It's too high. Sorry, my computer. Oh, no. I'll read it. Just 2 days before D-Day, Reverend Michael Dalton, a native of Goodrich, Ontario, and a chaplain of the Essex Scottish Regiment, presides at a mass with a jeep standing for the altar in England. Father Dalton, who served Canadian troops throughout the war, became one of the most decorated priests in history. So we see them engaged. This tension between church and combat. The church, in many cases, as I said, honored, and men went off to fight. That was the one decision. So we see, the officers of the Christian Endeavor, all these Christian fellows in their church, their pictures were up, and off they went to war. This is just a picture of a Nazi chaplain. This is a naval chaplain serving for Germany. You can see the tension, right? You've got the swastika and the cross. The swastika above the cross, he's caught in this tension, weird tension. This is the one priest, the chaplain we're going to focus on, this German fellow here. German chaplains were confronted with three major issues. Bonnie Hayes.
First, did they agree with Nazi ideology or on key issues? Second, were the chaplains loyal primarily to the state, the men, or the church? And how much distinction did they make between the three? Third, to what extent did the chaplains act upon these loyalties and motives?
So you can see the tension that they're living under, right? You've got the requirements of the state. You have rules you have to follow as a chaplain. You're loyal to your men, but also you're loyal to your church, and especially for those from institutional churches where you need certain rituals and practices to function. In a slit trench on the Eastern Front, you can't do mass. So how do you meet the spiritual needs of your men without the institutional tools of your church? Within the German army, they officially held the rank of major, and they wore a major's uniform. They did not, however, wear the epaulets of a major, but they wore an armband with a purple stripe in between two white stripes on which a red cross was placed. Here's the problem. If you're dressed like a German major on the Eastern Front, what do you look like? A German major. And the Russians will shoot you. In addition, they also wore a cross, as you saw in a lot of the pictures, plain metal for Protestants and a wooden cross with the Corpus Christi for Catholic. They also wore a pistol on their hip, which they're allowed to use for self-defense and for the defense of the wounded. But it's interesting, from the chaplain's perspective in policing, in Canada we don't carry firearms, but our American colleagues do. And it's weird because they'll carry their 38 on their hip as a chaplain. And we go to these conferences and we just don't understand their mindset. Like, why do you need a gun? Like, you're a chaplain. In the case of World War II, yeah, maybe there was something to be said. But their uniforms on the Eastern Front looked a lot like the SS uniforms. Had the same cut and many times the same color. And so they really didn't like looking like SS officers, but they had to. And they were allowed to preach. Murray.
The chaplains were often uncomfortable with these uniforms, owing to their similarity with those of the SS. Topics such as the Bolshevik threat and the avoidance of sexual adventure were encouraged, but no word about anti-Semitism or about conflicts between command and conscience was to be spoken.
So the German chaplains were restricted in what they could talk about. You aren't supposed to talk about the Jewish issue, and you're not allowed to talk about the individual's tension between their own conscience and following orders, as you can well imagine is one of the primary problems a soldier would have. How do I do what my officer is telling me when I have a conflict of conscience, especially as a Christian soldier? But they were forbidden from talking about that. In the early months of 1939, they were allowed to distribute religious tracts, but had to go through the propaganda ministry first. So you imagine the content of those tracts. Was a sham as the propaganda ministry prohibited from them delivering, and by June of 1940, basically all church periodicals were suspended. You couldn't send confessional materials or Bibles until July of 1940. So let's take a look. In the time we've got a lot of material, but we'll probably cover a couple of weeks. This is the case of Chaplain Joseph Peru, who we showed earlier on in the forest there, who was a Roman Catholic who served on the Eastern Front. You see him having mass here. Just so you know, the source, this is taken from two books, Germany is Our Mission by Doris Bergen and Sheep Among the Wolves, or Part of the Pack, Men of God in Hitler's Armies. Where are we at? Who are you pointing to? Oh, did I miss you, Bonnie? Oh, sorry, Bonnie.
He served as first in the medical corps and later as a commissioned chaplain. His recollections and experiences are left behind in a diary stretching from June 1940 to May 1945, published in 1962. He was incarcerated for 4 days for an improper response to a superior and felt that he had shamed the priesthood. His experiences caused him to believe that the officers hated the priesthood.
Yeah, and they really did. Because they were Nazis. They had no use for Catholic priests or Protestant priests. All right, buddy, you're doing great.
He expressed discomfort as before with the concept of wearing a uniform so similar to that of the SS. He clearly disliked the SS, noting that donning an SS uniform would be one of the last things he would want to do. He reacted with discomfort and sorrow to the fact that he could be mistaken for an SS officer. He carried the title Kriegsbearer, literally war pastor, which Perot saw as a contradiction.
He didn't like his title and he didn't like his uniform. That was you were officially a war pastor, which is a contradiction in terms.
How about you be a prayer warrior?
You could be a prayer warrior. Donna. Oh, Harlan.
That says a secret service.
Nope, the special service.
Oh, special,
Yeah.
sorry.
This is Hitler's private army.
Sorry.
No, that's good. I should have clarified that. Good. How was your reading this morning, Harlan?
No, that's in there.
That's good? Okay, Donna.
In an especially troubled entry, he recounted his thoughts upon seeing a mass grave of Russian prisoners in Ralswald. The guard tells me there are already about 19,000 therein. I look over the edge of the grave and see many layers of tangled corpses with wide eyes and clenched hands, a terrible accusation. He noted that the soldiers took up Nazi ideas but melded them with their pre-existing Christian ideas.
Because he served on the Eastern Front, the level of atrocities that he saw are staggering. Dylan, can you read from back there?
Oh, yeah. He became increasingly depressed towards the end of the war. At that time, he recorded a sort of unholy lostness from living in a land without Sabbath, without churches, possessed only by soldiers. Gables in 1942 ordered that the vacancies ordered that the vacancies within the chaplaincy would no longer be filled. This was of great consequence as chaplains were required to position themselves in areas of the fiercest fighting, which led to a high casualty rate and became known as the Uriah Law.
Uriah was sent out to battle to die, right? If you're a German chaplain on the Eastern Front wearing an SS uniform, not being allowed to shoot anybody, and tending to what are the odds of you being shot? Very, very high, yeah. They had a terrible casualty rate. Because they would put themselves in harm's way, right? He was exceedingly disenchanted by August of 1944 when his unit suffered great losses as it retreated. Perot called these casualties blood sacrifices and was fairly certain that Germany had lost the war. Perot and his comrades privately rejoiced when they heard the news of Hitler's death, noting that he was thankful for that life which is newly given to us, we can breathe, but kept these feelings as such words were still very dangerous. His feelings are best summed up by his comment of the characteristic Nazi greeting, Heil Hitler is no longer required. German chaplains found themselves in a trap. Joyce.
Ultimately, all chaplains, including German Christians, were part of the destructive trap. In order to protect the chaplaincy's existence, they fought to prove and reprove that they met a real need of the troops and raise morale. But the more the chaplains demonstrated loyal commitment to the goals of Hitler's war, the more they promoted atrocities, murder, and genocide, and undermined their moral authority as agents of the Christian message. In their situation, acceptance, either explicit or implicit, of the German Christian synthesis may have seemed the only hope of survival. Instead, it was a profound betrayal.
So you can see the tension of a German chaplain. How do you encourage soldiers who are committing atrocities? How do you give hope to those who are committing evil? How do you then, within your own soul, and the inner turmoil of the soul became the destructive force. And they tended to either basically just give up or become an agent of the state. Which we ultimately, as Doris calls it, the profound betrayal. Just to put it in comparison, at the outset of the war, on the German side, there were 560 priests in the military chaplaincy. By 1943, 424 chaplains were serving. You can see but in the U.S., in the European theater alone, there were 863 Roman Catholic chaplains. The total U.S. Army, there were 8,896 chaplains in service. In Canada, there were 1,253 who were priests and rabbis, 807 Protestants, 446 Roman Catholics, and 10 Jewish rabbis. So you can see, really, the chaplaincy program in Germany was tiny and discouraged, while on the Allied side, it was encouraged. So let's take a look at the contrasting story. And this is the story of the Canadian chaplain. This is taken from John McGinnis's work, God's Silent Witness, Protestant Chaplains. Danny.
Canadian historian Dunkirk said of the military chaplain, the field, padres, and mine often filled with traumatic memories. Smell of death, awe and horror at the extent of destructiveness of men. The horrors of burying men, long dead, often blown to pieces or burned to cinders, and incredible physical and spiritual exhaustion.
How do you be hope in that situation? As Canada entered the war, 97% of Canadians identify themselves as Christians. Put that in perspective. Just about half and half, but predominantly Protestant. But there was no chaplains corps. Early in the 1930s, the Anglicans and the Baptists, the predominant churches in Canada, produced these declarations against the war. any participation in Canada. War as a method of settling internal disputes is incompatible with the teaching example. So there were no chaplains, and the church was opposed to any action. For some progressives and social gospelers, the anti-sentiment for war went so far as they backed what was called the Peace Manifesto, that there would be no armed conflict. For others, it was directly linked to the events of the 1930s. And Anglican bishops in 1930 denounced any involvement in the war whatsoever. So the church at the beginning is completely opposed to the war. Unlike Anglicans and Baptist churches, the United Church deepened their resolve against the war in the 1930s progressed. Basically, by the late 30s, everybody within the structural base of the church, not every individual obviously, is opposed to war. The Baptists in 1938 said, "Be it resolved, this convention urged the churches in the event of war neither to bless nor to give support to its organizations." How long do you think that lasted? Until 1939. Jack.
When war was declared in September 1939, Canada's church performed an about-face and tripped over themselves to declare ringing endorsements of the government's declaration of war, beginning with the words, "Without being
Pharisaic,
and without thinking ourselves 100% right, and everybody else 100% wrong."
The Baptists United said, maybe we should change our mind on this. And they did a complete 180. There was a radical destiny. T.T. Shields was kind of a Baptist who was anti-Baptist. He's a complicated guy. But he called upon the government to destroy the madman Hitler and Mussolini. The president of the Baptist Convention, J.A. Johnson, caked upon his followers to keep cool heads. Shields is going, no, kill him. And Johnson saying, whoa. Johnson summarized the Baptist position in a letter of support to the Prime Minister. He wrote, "We profoundly support you wholeheartedly in your own action, believing in the justice of our cause. Consistent with our Christian faith and our love of liberty and democracy, these have always been the basic principles of the Baptist position." They went 180 degrees over. By order of Privy Council, June 13, 1921, the chaplain service, when it existed in the First World War, was removed. So during the 20s and 30s, there was no chaplain corps in Canada. Units could get their own chaplain if they wanted, but there was nothing official. And so the denominations pushed for chaplaincy, which is unusual. It's the churches that said, our boys who are going overseas need chaplains. And so the government said, okay, I guess we can do that. And so churches mobilized their own army of chaplains without benefit of any government policy or procedure. There was no place for them. But the clergy said, we want to serve. And as fall of 39 turned into winter, we get the Protestant chaplaincy service now beginning within the Canadian Army. All right, here are the requirements for a Canadian chaplain. Where are we looping around to? I guess we're back to Grady. Colin.
Religious, the dominating purpose of a chaplain's life is to provide for the spiritual needs of his fellows. Their chaplain's one aim is to help them build up a strong army, strong in the Lord and strong in the power of his might. So
that's what the chaplains were there for from a religious perspective, to build up a strong army, strong in the Lord and the power of his might. Secondly, you're doing great, Colin.
Natural. The chaplain mingles freely with all ranks. He is the friend and comrade to all and encourages all ranks to address him as padre or chaplain. Padre just means father, right? Within the RCMP, chaplains hold the rank of the individual they are speaking to plus a day. So you always have 1 day more service than the person you're talking to. So it gives you that hint of superiority, right? But it doesn't exist. But it allows you that when you're talking to a commissioner, you have the same rank as the commissioner. You have the rights and privileges of conversation as you would with a cadet who just got out of depot. So it's an interesting ranking system. Equal to plus a day.
So that's still...
Yeah, that's our policy.
Okay.
Yeah. So, when I talk to a sergeant, I'm a sergeant. When I talk to Chris, I'm a corporal. Yeah, all the way down the ranks and all the way up the ranks. So, if you have breakfast, let's say, with a commissioner, you can have breakfast with the commissioner and not feel that you're lesser. So, because they need to know where you fit in within their structure. So, because if you're just a sergeant, well then, a CO can't talk to you as an equal. But if you're the same rank as the commissioner, then you have the same conversation. So it's a clever ranking.
Wouldn't that also make it so that if you need to say, there's something you have to work on, you can't say it unless you're equal?
That's right. And you have a little superiority. You have more service than they do. It's a bizarre system, but it works. This is my favorite one, Grady. I called him. I keep looking at Grady. Colton, you're doing great.
Physical chaplains must be between the ages of 30 and 50 years, be medically passed by a medical board, such as medically fit, and must be cheerful.
You gotta be a cheerful person, for that. Good. Now, Grady.
Prior to 1943, chaplains received no military training. They were given a uniform and sent overseas. Canadian chaplain service were the only military officials responsible to seek the spiritual and moral welfare of the men by maintaining a high morale among them.
So can you imagine, there was no training program up to 43. They were just said, yep, you're now a chaplain, here's your uniform, you're a major, put you on a boat, off you go. All you had was your own religious training. Then by 43 they realized, maybe we should send them to officers training school for a couple of days. As a consequence, somewhat like their German comrade or colleagues, they lived in a tension. Joanna Burke, in her article, identifies their struggle in her book, An Intimate History of Killing. Chaplains often had a difficult time harmonizing the tenets of love and peace that lay at the heart of the New Testament with an encouragement to kill the enemy. The Canadian chaplain would have a trying time, however, attempting to deliver a message of hope, joy, peace, and love against combat. Chaplains were entrenched in the airborne. There's a wonderful story about a British chaplain in D-Day. He lands, he's airborne, and he loses his communion kit in a swamp, and he goes diving down to try and find his communion kit. When would he have time during that combat as an airborne to stop and have communion with the men? But he had to have his kit. And again, that tension between the institutional church and your love, but he was entrenched. He jumped out of an airplane with them, and I don't know if he lived or died, but Bonnie Hayes.
They faced a unique challenge. The chaplain had a unique role to play. When a soldier was killed, he was expected to withstand his own torrent of grief, and heavy grief was not uncommon when fellow soldiers were killed, and be a consoling presence for the men around him as well. The chaplain was expected to be an agent of closure for grieving men, conducting burial services and dealing with the emotional fallout death created.
So you can imagine these individuals who are living with these men who have no means of defending them. They're not armed in any way. And these people whom they have spent weeks, months with now die, and they're expected to maintain some level of composure and be a comforting presence around when they themselves are dealing with their own grief. So and that experience is very common as you're trying to process your own grief while you're trying to provide comfort. And publicly, you're not to grieve, you're to be a comfort, but then privately you grieve. And so chaplains lived in this extreme tension, and it was very difficult on their psyche to reconcile that world. Murray.
Chaplain Wilmot recalled retrieving bodies in a ghastly state of decomposition after they'd been hastily buried in slit trenches during battle. He describes this gruesome work in the wake of the battle for the Hitler line.
You're doing great, Murray. Let's pick it up.
This was an experience which I could never forget. Exhuming the bodies of men who had been buried in shell holes where they had fallen and bringing them for decent burial to the central cemetery beside the little Italian shrine. Decomposition had already commenced. Some had already been disturbed by Italians looking for a pair of boots, and prompted some very hard words about the people of the land on the part of the burial party. It took me weeks to get rid of the smell of death and decomposition which seemed to cling long after the experience.
Remember, you're not changing your clothes or showering, right? You're doing this day after day, and it stays with you. It's almost 1:45. Let's pause there, because we'll pick up the next section in Where's the Padre, the Canadian Memory of the Great War's Chaplains. They were not particularly liked. We'll pick it up next week.